In this section, we're going to talk briefly about the history of compliance as a field in healthcare, and we're also going to talk about the GoHealth Urgent Care Compliance and Ethics Program. So a bit about the history of compliance. Compliance as a field really came about in around 1991 when the U.S. Sentencing Commission put out the U.S. Sentencing Guidelines. And what these guidelines basically did was they said that at the federal level, the government would look at certain things to determine if organizations were trying to be compliant. And if they saw where organizations were doing these lists of 7 things. If you were found to have committed some kind of non-compliant behavior, the government would say, okay, you were non-compliant, but in a sense, you were still trying to be compliant. So you would get credit for the efforts that you made and potentially not have your penalties be as bad as they would be if you weren't trying to be compliant at all. So really the U.S. sentencing guidelines kind of set up the framework for what compliance programs should be, because we knew exactly what the government was looking for and what their expectations were, and so then we knew from there how to structure our compliance programs. In 1996, the federal government passed the Healthcare Fraud and Abuse Control Program. And this program really gave the federal government proactive auditing and monitoring authority over providers and what their claims were that they were submitting to Medicare and Medicaid. Prior to this, the government had some retroactive auditing powers. So if they thought that a provider was committing fraud, they could go in and do retroactive audits and look at what they had built up to that point. But they didn't have a lot of authority or power to go in proactively or without an allegation of fraud to say, okay, we're going to take a peek and just see what these providers are doing. Even if there's no allegation of fraud, we just want to look proactively and ensure that they are billing appropriately. And since then, the federal government has continued to increase their oversight in healthcare matters and continues to increase their anti-fraud auditing and monitoring activities. A great example of how this has continued to increase since 1996 is as part of the Affordable Care Act, $350 million was allocated to fight fraud, waste, and abuse in the Medicare and Medicaid systems over 10 years. And for every dollar the government spends in anti-fraud efforts, they're seeing about a $7 return on that investment, if you want to look at it in that way. So they spend $1 trying to stop fraud, and they stop $7 roughly in fraud in the system. And then every year almost, we've seen in recent years that it's a record recovery year for the federal government as far as the number of dollars that they stop in fraud. And every year is it's over $1 billion. In recent years, it's been $2 to $4 billion per year that the government stops in fraud as part of their anti-fraud efforts. So who are some of the regulatory agencies in healthcare that are looking at what we do here at GoHealth? To start at the top, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is the federal agency that's responsible for administering the Medicare and Medicaid programs, exactly like their name sounds. The Office of Inspector General is probably somebody you've heard about if you've worked in healthcare for any number of time. The OIG is the kind of key enforcement agency in healthcare at the federal level. They do the proactive audits we were just talking about on providers. They look at billing, they look at privacy, they look at pretty much anything and everything from a healthcare perspective. And they want to make sure that providers are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing in our industry. The Department of Justice is probably somebody you definitely don't want to hear from, in that the Department of Justice, or DOJ, investigates and prosecutes allegations of criminal conduct in healthcare. So if you hear from the Department of Justice, you probably already know you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing in the first place, but nevertheless, they generally handle criminal investigative matters. The Office for Civil Rights is the federal agency that enforces the HIPAA privacy and security rules. So if you were to violate someone's privacy rights or cause a breach or something else along those lines, you would hear from the OCR. The Medicaid fraud control units are state-based fraud investigation teams that coordinate their efforts with the federal government. And essentially what they do is they want to ensure that that every dollar that's paid for Medicaid services is paid correctly, and they coordinate their data and their efforts with the federal government to ensure that individuals aren't defrauding state Medicaid programs, and they move in very quickly based on the data that they share with the federal government to make sure that anybody who they find is violating or committing fraud is quickly removed from the program. Zone program integrity contractors are contractors that are hired by CMS. So these are private companies that are hired by CMS to essentially mine CMS's billing data and find weird patterns in the data. And when they find these, they'll refer them over to either the OIG or Department of Justice for further review. And basically from there, the DOJ or OIG will dive into it more, and if they find that it's fraud, they'll prosecute the fraud, and then the zone program integrity contractors actually will get a portion of the money that they found to be fraudulent. So they're actually incentivized to find fraud in the Medicare and Medicaid systems. And then we have the state attorneys general, and this is similar to the DOJ, but it's at the state level. And essentially what the state attorneys general are interested in is prosecuting Medicaid fraud, waste, and abuse, or potentially even breaches and privacy violations at the state level. So our compliance program's purpose is to ensure that GoHealth is always complying with all the laws and regulations that are out there that apply to us as a healthcare company. Our industry is highly, highly regulated, and will continue to be into the future. And we just need to make sure that all of our regulations, ethical obligations, and legal responsibilities are upheld to the best of our abilities. So our compliance program has all 7 elements of an effective compliance program. These are based on the U.S. sentencing guidelines that we just talked about. And we just want to ensure that we are doing everything that we need to uphold our legal, ethical, and patient care obligations. So for our compliance program, we have a director of compliance, a chief compliance officer, and various committees, including board level oversight of the program, to ensure that everything that we are doing is sufficient to uphold our compliance and regulatory obligations. We also have a standards of conduct and policies and procedures that we will talk about more in a bit, but we encourage everybody to understand and review the standards of conduct and our policies and procedures as they apply to your job. We also provide education and training. So for all new hires, you're expected to complete your education within 30 days of hire. And then annually thereafter, you'll complete your compliance education by June 30th of each year. We also conduct auditing and monitoring activities, and these are proactive audits that we do based around the processes and systems that we have in place here at GoHealth. We just want to make sure that everything that we're doing to comply with the rules and regulations that are out there is working correctly. As an employee here at GoHealth, you may be asked to participate in an audit. Please understand that we look during our audits at processes. We don't look at and audit individuals. 99.9% of the time when an issue occurs, it's not because somebody's intentionally trying to violate a rule or regulation. It's because there's a process or a system failure somewhere that didn't work as intended. So we don't audit individuals, we look at processes. We also encourage open communication for everybody here at GoHealth. You can report any questions or concerns you have to your manager, directly to the compliance department, or through our anonymous hotline, which we have. It's called the Compliance and Ethics Hotline. And we're going to talk more about how you can raise your concerns in a bit. But we very, very strongly encourage open communication here at GoHealth. Anytime we receive a report of noncompliance, we will thoroughly investigate the allegations. If we find at the end of our investigation that there are actually areas of noncompliance, we're going to issue corrective actions. That could be in the form of new policies and procedures, it could be in the form of process changes, or a variety of other methods. But we will correct every instance of noncompliance through our corrective actions. And finally, if we do find through an audit or through an investigation that there is someone who is intentionally trying to violate internal policy or procedure or law and regulation, we will take appropriate disciplinary actions in those instances. And we have a disciplinary policy around that as well. So the structure of our compliance program, we have a chief compliance officer and a compliance director that oversees all components of the compliance program. We also have a compliance committee that meets monthly, and this is a cross-disciplinary team made up of legal, HR, compliance, IT, revenue cycle experts that review the compliance issues that have come up and ensure that the appropriate action and follow through has been taken. After this video, you'll have a chance to download the Standards of Conduct, and we encourage you to review those standards very closely. The standards outline the behavior that you're expected to uphold as an employee here at GoHealth. It also is a really great resource for you because even if you don't know the letter of the regulations that are out there and every nuance to the rules that apply to healthcare, the standards of conduct have been developed in a way so that if you abide by the standards of conduct, you're going to abide by the rules and regulations that apply to us as a healthcare organization. So you don't have to know the ins and outs of HIPAA. You don't need to know the ins and outs of the False Claims Act. If you're following the standards of conduct, you can be guaranteed and assured that you'll be in compliance with the laws and regulations that apply to us. So please take some time in the near future to review the standards of conduct.